How a Romance Novel Saved the Galaxy by Ariana Perrote. Chapter 84. Epilogue. Jedi. Mom, why? Typed Stas Ali into the comm. She eyed the Mandalorian standing in their room. She'd introduced herself as Nael Holja, Clan Irume. She, her, I'm your bodyguard until you return to the Jedi Temple. Master Tikloth had heard this and immediately declared he was going to meditate and sleep. In the Force, though, she strongly was told to sort this out with her mother. Her comm lit up just a few seconds later. Stas, dear heart, how are you? Asked her mom. She looked like she was dressed for a party in brightly patterned clothes, so it must be later in the evening on Coruscant. Not very well since someone sent a Mandalorian babysitter on me. Stas ignored the snort from the Mandalorian in question. Well, your cousin gave me this delightful romance novel, and I was just so worried about you, so I thought if I couldn't provide you any backup on my own, I'd find a dashing Mandalorian to do so. There's no specific rules forbidding it from the Jedi. I checked. Her bureaucrat mother sounded terribly affronted that her daughter would ever accuse her of circumventing the rules. Stas sighed. Regardless of it not being against the rules, and you know that Master Tikloth is already being nice to let you keep such close contact even though I'm not a knight yet. We can't just have a Mandalorian show up and follow us around. Mom, you know what it looks like to be followed by a Mandalorian bodyguard. Go on this mission or... She paused to think of a good threat. I definitely won't come and visit even when I do return to Coruscant. Mom pouted. Oh, well, if you insist. She poked around out of view for a minute. There you are. The mission is cancelled. I have to be going now, but do come home soon and visit there. She waved and cut the comm. Sure enough, a minute later, there was a faint chime out of the comm on Nael's arm. She checked it with what had to be feigned boredom, but otherwise didn't move. So you'll be leaving now? Nael didn't even politely pretend to think. No. Why not? You're obviously on an important mission and you need a backup. And if having a Mandalorian with us interferes with our mission? Nael looked her up and down. Well then, I'll just take off my armor and guard you anyway. It's definitely important to get that cute face of yours back to Coruscant in one piece. Stas shook her head. She was at an impasse. She knew the Mandalorians had been accompanying Jedi on missions, either officially or unofficially, and this particular Mandalorian seemed determined to stay. She sighed. You may as well sit down, she said to Yael. Then she pulled up her comm and began composing a long message for her cousin Adigalia. She'd let the council deal with this. Solnay didn't like how dark the Force felt anywhere in this place. He was near the middle levels of the 500 Republica building, which housed the richest of the rich of Coruscant's elite. While he supposed it made sense that the majority of the inhabitants made their fortunes on the misery of those beneath them, he could have sworn it was getting worse as he worked his way through maintenance shafts to the apartment of Sheev Palpatine, Senator to Naboo. 500 Republica boasted high security for its residents, so Thalmay was forced to take a very surreptitious route to get to the corridor opposite the apartment door. Once there, he settled in to wait for Quinlan's signal. Shadow research into Palpatine, conducted long before Thalmay was recalled from his mission helping the Mandalorians, showed that Palpatine had levered his connections as a senator and from the noble Palpatine family to get a very nice, if not palatial, apartment in 500 Republica soon after he arrived on Coruscant for his term. Other shadows were still working on tracking the man's surprisingly complicated and well-hidden financials to see where his wealth was coming from. Wealth the senator had inexplicably used to bribe Senate researchers to send a large group of Jedi to Galdadron. Thalmay would honestly rather be back on Aquila's ship tracking down Death Watch, and hopefully he and Quinlan would be able to return there after this mission, but after Terra, Thalmay was the most knowledgeable shadow about Coruscant. In the pod, the comm roused Thalm from the light meditation he'd fallen into. The security for this building monitored all communications, so they were keeping transmissions short and to the point. Quinlan's comm meant that Palpatine was in the senatorial pod for Naboo. Thalmay and Terra had decided that was the safest time to make a move, because even if the senator was notified about the break-in, he'd have to cut off whatever he was doing and move the slow senatorial pod back to its dock before heading back to 500 Republica. Thalmay sent a sense of readiness to Terra, who was posing as a maintenance worker. Several minutes later, the Jedi Master came into view carrying a pack full of miscellaneous tools. Terra took his time, putting up an under-construction sign before disabling the entrance security and surveillance for the corridor. Salme leapt down, landing silently using the Force. He was about to head through the now open door when Terra thrust out an arm to stop him. "There's more surveillance inside," said Terra. He went back to fiddling with the controls. "There, it is looped." "Paranoid, isn't he?" said Thalme as they went inside. For a Nubian, Palpatine's apartment was surprisingly understated. The color red dominated, from red nerf-hide couches to red curtains and alcoves with red walls behind them over a red floor. There were various esoteric art pieces elegantly placed along the edges of the room. Terra regarded them thoughtfully, then pulled out his comm to snap hollows of each piece of art. Solney was certain Terra would be showing those hollows to Jocasta Nu before the day was up. Perhaps Palpatine's taste in art would explain why he was obsessed with sending so many Jedi to Galadran. That one relief certainly did seem to show Jedi fighting. Solney headed for the man's desk and console. Unfortunately, it was a Servomaster 3000 model, and Thalme would need several hours of slicing to access it, nor did the Force nudge him towards any helpful hidden drawers or a conveniently written-down passcode. Terra was still occupied with all the art in the receiving room and the corridor leading to the balcony, so Thalme headed for the bedroom. Nothing was unusual in there, other than discovering Palpatine had the good taste to have an Alderanian relax-a-bed. His wardrobe was huge, though understated for a Nubian. Once again the Force was silent. Solney considered what he knew of the layout of rich apartments and went searching for the emergency escape lift. "Very cold on that balcony," said Terra, coming into the antechamber he was searching. Salme pulled away one of the ubiquitous red curtains. "Aha!" He could see a door behind it. His comm vibrated. He pulled it out. "Leaving." A few seconds later came another word. "Fast!" Thalme almost shuddered at the sudden surge of warning he got from the Force. "Don't follow," he said to Quinlan, breaking their calm silence. "I'm taking the lift," he told Terra. It was preferable to crawling out through miles of air ducts. Terra nodded. "The loop will end in 1 minute." Thalme turned his attention to the lift behind the curtain. Emergency lifts like this were all of the same type, small with minimal controls, so they were easy for a panicked owner to use. The door swished open at the touch of a button. Thalme had to use the Force to pull the curtain back into place before letting the door shut, and the lift headed downward. He expected it to let him out at the nominal bottom of the building, where it went underground and didn't allow 500 Republica to charge for balconies and views. In fact, the blueprints he'd pulled up showed the whole owned building extended several levels below, with small apartments for servants and security personnel. Of course, this being Coruscant, there was a whole other sealed-off building below this one, and probably another below that. And it seems Thalme would find out, since the lift didn't stop at any of the inhabited levels, just descended smoothly. It opened on smoke. The acrid smoke of burnt electronics and the shadows of flames past it. Also the smell of chemicals, as some fire suppression system worked hard. Thalme slammed the close button again. After a moment's consideration, he climbed up the emergency hatch at the top of the lift, then found a maintenance entrance that wasn't radiating heat. He'd go around the area, find another entrance, and wait for the fire suppression system to do its job. He sent a comm to Quinlan, ordering him back to the temple. Hopefully, it would get through all the buildings above him. Then Thalme settled in to meditate, waiting for the fire to die down enough to investigate why a regular senator would have a secret lair so far away from the inhabited levels of Coruscant. Mace was heading back to his rooms after lunch, having sent Obi-Wan ahead of him, when he received a comm asking him to come to the atrium as a Mandalorian was requesting him. There were a number of knights and masters lingering in the temple atrium. At first, Mace would have contributed their curiosity to the Mandalorian standing there, but then he got close enough to sense what the other Jedi were sensing. Darkness, despair, and pain centered around the young being with the Mandalorian. A Mandalorian whose green and silver armor Mace belatedly recognized. They were the Force-sensitive Mandalorian with a Zabrak toddler he'd met in Little Kaldabe several weeks before. A faint smell of smoke lingered around them. though they and the being with them look unharmed. This new Zabrak, but the Mando wasn't a toddler, but maybe 8 or 9 with red skin and black tattoos in a pattern Mace didn't recognize. They had their feet planted widely and a snarl on their face, standing in front of the large Mandalorian in armor. As Mace approached, the kid instinctively backed into the Mandalorian's chest, and they put a steadying protective hand on the kid's arm. An arm which, up close, was way too skinny under the tattoos. "Can I help you?" he asked the Mandalorian. They nodded their helmeted head. "Yes, Master Jedi. This is Maul. I found him in a labyrinth deep below what I believe to be 500 Republica. He has much to tell you. I would also like your healers to look him over, since he seems to be cold." Yes, that would be the dark side, which was clinging to the child. Mace was getting a headache just looking at him. There would be some who would advocate for throwing the child out immediately, but Mace knew that following the Mandalorian way was the best choice here, or at least it made his headache lessen slightly from the shatter point. He pulled out his comm. "Obi-Wan, please meet me at the healers. I need help with something." That should assure Obi-Wan the healers weren't after him. His Padawan had already been wary of them since Brooke-chan had weaponized them against him by always reporting to them first and having his story be the established one. But Master Che had also been her aggressive, caring self upon his return to the temple, and Obi-Wan was a bit scared of her now. Considering she scolded the council with impunity, Mace didn't blame him at all. "Yes, Master." He started leading the Mandalorian and the boy towards the healers. He and Obi-Wan had parted just a few minutes ago for Obi-Wan to go change into some training clothes for their daily sparring session. Mace had been pleased to discover that apart from some low grades in astronavigation, Obi-Wan was either average or above average in most of his courses. This meant he was easily able to start taking the Padawan level courses. Mace wanted him to have some uninterrupted time regularly seeing a mind healer, so they had yet to go on any missions. Instead, he'd spent the past month at the temple untangling himself from council duties, bonding with his new Padawan, and getting to know Holdan La, who would cheerfully follow them back to the temple. Mace had had a word with him about attachment and how this would look to other Jedi, but had been pleasantly surprised that La remained just a steady presence in Obi-Wan's life, checking in on him once a day, usually keeping him company when he did his homework in the afternoons or eating a meal with them. The Mandalorian kept himself busy doing small jobs on planet and discreetly meeting some of the Jedi who liked casual sex. He also had Faye's comm address and kept her regularly in touch with her newest Grand Padawan. Mace suspected that he and Obi-Wan would be assigned at least partially to the temple on Mandalore one of these days, but the establishment of the temple there was in its infancy. For now, he was grateful to be back on Coruscant, where he was able to settle Obi-Wan properly into Padawanship and see Sutra when he could. He ushered the Mandalorian and the kid into one of the more private examination rooms. "Do you have a name I could call you?" he asked the Mandalorian. The Mandalorian thought for a time. "You may call me Galar." It was an obvious pseudonym, but Mace wouldn't begrudge them their privacy. He'd learned from Sutra that, just like the romance novel had mentioned, there were clans that kept their personal names private. "What may I call you?" he asked, squatting down so he was level with the Zabrak child's face. The child bared their teeth at him reflexively, but said a quiet, "Maul," in a rough voice. Healer Volkara Che, a blue-skinned Twi'lek, chose that moment to enter the room with Obi-Wan beside her. His Padawan stopped abruptly, obviously sensing the dark side around Maul, but once he saw Mace, he continued onwards. Volkara gave the child a long look, but patiently stood back. "Sukuiga," Obi-Wan said politely to Galar, nodding his head in a half-bow. "Well met, Adika," responded the Mandalorian. "Obi-Wan, this is Maul. Galar here found them and brought them to the temple today. I was thinking you could tell Maul a bit about Jedi and Mandalorians while Healer Che examines them." Obi-Wan nodded seriously. "Come, we can sit on the bed?" he suggested to Maul, holding out a hand. "It is comfier than the floor." Maul regarded the hand dubiously, but scrambled after Obi-Wan when he went over to the bed instead. They were soon settled right next to each other, and Maul seemed to calm. Except then Volkara approached, and they stiffened. Obi-Wan and Maul held a whispered conversation, which ended with Maul tightly gripping Obi-Wan's nearest hand, but allowing Volkara to get close. Figuring that was the best they were going to get, Mace turned back to Galar.
Could you give me more details about where you found them?
He asked in a low voice. They'd need to send shadows to investigate. Galar nodded their silver and green helmet.
I was hunting a bounty in the underlevels. They had robbed someone in 500 Republica who hired me to retrieve them and their head.
They held out a bounty puck, though Mace would just take their word for it, having no way of reading it.
I thought I would pick up their escape trail through the lower levels, then move from there, but instead my scans picked up a heat signature. I sent one of my scouts.
They gestured at a row of 3 tiny droids embedded in their members.
To look, and there was a spider-like droid teaching the child. Only the child was painfully shocked every time they got an answer wrong. There were also slave cuffs on the ad's wrists. I shot the droid and the system that was shocking Maul. Then I released him from the cuffs. I didn't notice the fire for a while since it was so cold down there. His master had him sleeping in a bare room with just chains on the wall. It was only after I got out of there that I noticed the cold seemed to follow Maul and thought it might be the Force. You and Master Tholme are the only Jedi I have met, so I requested you when I arrived. I'll pass this info on to Tholme immediately,
Mace promised. He didn't know what Tholme was working on, but he knew the Shadow was back on Coruscant since Quinlan had made a show out of finding and spending time with Obi-Wan upon their return 2 days ago. Tholme would pass this info on to Terra. Volkara had finished her examination, leaving Obi-Wan talking softly to Maul. She approached them both.
He is under raid and shows signs of a long period of abuse, including persistent electrical shock. If I thought it wouldn't hurt him mentally, I'd suggest putting him in a bacta tank for a few days, but he apparently hasn't had contact with beings other than his master for years. She snarled on the word master.
Maul had been a slave then, but one strangely steeped in the dark side. That wasn't to say that a child couldn't learn to use the dark side on their own, but generally children tended to reach out to both sides of the Force if they had no guidance.
You scanned for a chip?
Asked Galar. They sounded worried.
I should have checked before I brought him out.
If it was an explosive rather than a tracking chip, that would have resulted in Maul's and probably Galar's death once they got far away enough. Fortunately, the Force had been with them.
Bakara nodded. It's standard procedure. He's clean.
Master? Asked Obi-Wan. Mace looked up to see Maul was occupied looking at something on Obi-Wan's pad. In Obi-Wan's hand was another pad, which Maul must have been carrying. He thrust it at Mace. Mace took it. The pad was organized much like any educational pad, with topics like history, language, and galactic geography, but when he clicked on history, he nearly dropped the pad in shock. There, under ancient history, was the text of the Codex of Carnus Mor, one of the first Sith texts from over 5,000 years ago he had learned of as a senior Padawan. Although he didn't know the texts that followed, a quick look inside them revealed they all seemed to be dark side or actual Sith texts. In fact, in one other section on philosophy was a document entitled The Code. In it was a perverted inversion of the Jedi Code talking about peace being a lie and passion and power leading to victory. He flipped back to slightly more recent history, finding the rule of the strong, which was the philosophy of Darth Khan during the Sith Wars 1,000 years ago, and the doctrine of the dyad, which was a philosophy followed by a different sect of Sith during the same time period. Darth Bane's rule of 2 should have been the last Sith document to appear on the list, even though Mace was certain that the Jedi had no copy of it, just the dying words of Darth Bane stating his philosophy. Mace's feeling of dread mounted as he saw more and more documents following that one, some whose literal authors were just listed as Darth. He shuddered, feeling a piercing pain in his head from a shatter point looming large.
Maul?
He called, causing the boy to look up from Obi-Wan's pad.
What did your master call themselves?
Maul had a look of disgust and anger on his face.
Darth Sidious.
Mace was grateful for Volkara's steadying hand on his shoulder as the pain caused his vision to fade out for a moment. The Sith had returned.
You're certain of this?
Asked Jan. Komari had tears at the corners of her eyes, but looked resolute nonetheless.
Yes, Master.
He and Komari had returned to the temple after their weeks on Mandalore to a very different schedule than they usually engaged in, instead of Gomari signing up for some long-distance courses before they headed back out into the field. They both had regular mind healer sessions, and Gomari was encouraged to take a large number of in-person classes, as well as clubs and other activities for senior Padawans. A month of this, and she had come to him 2 nights ago to say that she felt called to be a Mandalorian rather than a Jedi, and would he help her leave the order?
"I'm going to miss you,"
she said. She knew him well enough to know he wouldn't want to hug, but he rested his hand on her head for a brief moment. He had arranged her transport. He'd tucked some odds and ends she'd left lying around that she claimed not to want in her bags, including her lightsaber crystal. She had turned it over to him after the official resignation was sent. He had pointed out that there was no rule a Jedi leaving the Order needed to leave their saber, but she had been adamant he'd take it. A Jedi's lightsaber was their life, however, and he was loath to part her fully from it. The crystal was hers and always would be.
"I suspect that will not be the last time I'm on Mandalore,"
he said with some humor, especially since Jaster had proposed to both him and Joe right before they left. Jaster had said to give him an answer when next they met, and while Jan suspected Joe was leaning towards yes, judging by her wearing the vambrace everywhere, Jan was going to decline, since he wasn't made for such things. He doubted it would change much in their relationship either way.
"May the Force be with you, Commander Vosa,"
he said formally. They were in the Jedi flight hangar, since Dooku had gotten her a ride with some Agra Corps who were heading that way. She bowed low.
"May the Force be with you too, Master."
He stiffened when she surprised him with a quick hug and thrust something at him before all but running towards the transport. He looked down. In his hand was her blonde Padawan braid. He sighed and placed it gently in his robe pocket. He was feeling melancholy as he made his way out of the hangar. While he and Komari hadn't always had the best of relationships, she had still been his Padawan for many years. He was also feeling a bit sorry for himself at what a poor teacher he'd turned out to be. Yet another subject to discuss with the Trasa when next he saw her for a session. He paused when he saw the large crowd of Jedi and Corps members gathered at the edges of what seemed to be a break room for the mechanics and pilots. A large hollow screen dominated the wall near one side. "We will play the recording again in a moment," said the grand newscaster. "But first, what's your take on this ritual?" The view shifted to a beautiful Zeltran with bright pink skin.
"I think we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves until we find a body heal. The search has been ongoing for several hours now, but with the winds around 500 Republica, experts say the body could have been carried very far away."
"Hopefully they can get more useful footage from another angle," said Yil. "There's got to be hundreds of cams in 500 Republica."
"I'm told most of them are trained on the entrances and inwards," said Rachel. "That's why we have the image of the Jedi."
Dooku had been just about to move onwards rather than listening to this nonsense, but froze at the word Jedi. "For those just tuning in, here is the vid of what appears to be Senator Palpatine's assassination by attackers unknown." The image switched to a harried-looking human in blue Nubian robes, fiddling with controls in front of him.
"I'm Senator Sheev Palpatine of Naboo, and I'm recording this out of an abundance of caution. Earlier today, a Jedi invaded my apartment for reasons unknown. They skillfully removed any images of entering, but I keep passive recordings as well, and someone tried to access my files. Here is the Jedi disguised as a cleaner after entering the building."
The image showed Teresa Nube in maintenance overalls.
"I have recently learned that the Jedi have been interfering in the governance of Mandalore, and I suspect I am being targeted for refusing to back down. I promised—"
Palpatine was cut off by what looked like an explosion. Fire and force blasted out the glass doors behind him, shoving the man up and over the holocam field with a terrified yell. "We now have images of the inside of Palpatine's balcony showing a hole where he seems to have been catapulted after the explosion of his apartment," said Yil. Streaks of black carbon and debris covered a balcony filled with electronics with a large hole in the transparent steel above it. Jan turned and headed in the opposite direction he'd planned on. He was going to spend the evening wallowing in his corners, but now he headed for Jagasta's. If anyone was going to hear about this firsthand from the Jedi involved, it would be her. Jocasta adjusted the notes on her pad for the third time. the only nervous action she allowed herself these days. She really wished the Force hadn't chosen her to deliver yet another bombshell of information to the Jedi Council, and within a couple months of each other, too. At least she wasn't on her own this time. Jan was beside her, ready to talk about his own expertise in Sith artifacts. Mason Thalme had offered to come as well, but they weren't experts on Sith history. Her eye caught the Beskar vambrace on her left arm. Jaster had removed the weapons embedded in his own and replaced it with a small drone, perfect for archaeological surveys when she was in the field. It was that kind of thoughtfulness that had convinced her to accept Jaster's proposal, though she had yet to tell him. It would be a very complicated relationship to make official, especially since the Council had only recently approved Mandalorian-style marriages for Jedi, but they would make it work after a long engagement. While she hadn't told him of the Sith yet, she expected that her practical Mandalore would take the news of the Sith's return with aplomb and start immediately planning how to fight them. The point being, she had support if the Council decided to deny the return of the Sith, which she half expected them to do, if only out of fear. They had certainly dismissed Dark Jedi Kibin Jean's claims of the Sith's survival 150 years ago. And while they had artifacts and a reading list, they had no actual Sith unless you counted Maul. Jocasta certainly didn't, since he was too young to have memorized or perfected any of the Sith philosophies. Jocasta suspected it would come down to if they could convince Yoda, so it was fortunate she had one of his former apprentices with her. "Master Dooku Adnu, be welcome," said Oppo. The Thespian had his tail wrapped quite tightly around his chair today, as if bracing for what was to come. Jocasta approved. C and Yaddle were hollowing in from Mandalore. C had replaced Polly Dapashin when he had to step down due to his health on the condition that C could serve from the Mandalorian temple, and that he was nowhere near the finances of the Jedi, stating that it was for the best if he wasn't. They were also down a council member since no one had replaced Mace yet, but she had heard Tavoka was laboring hard to get Plo Koon to accept a spot. Jocasta didn't see any reason to beat around the bush.
Jedi Shadows and Mandalorians working together this week have uncovered that Senator Sheev Palpatine of Naboo is likely a Sith known as Darth Sidious, a Sith from the line of Bane,
she stated. Several of the council showed no surprise, likely warned by either Mace, Salme, or Tara.
When he realized we had discovered him and his apprentice, I believe he framed the Jedi and faked his death rather than risk a confrontation. This is also in line with what I've been reading of Darth Bane's grand plan for bringing down the Jedi, which includes the tenet of undermining the Jedi in any way possible until the Sith were strong enough to strike us down.
Speculation, this is,
said Yaddle. Jocasta nodded. Some of it is, though I will note that Maul has agreed that Palpatine has the same voice as his master Darth Sidious, though he has never seen his full face.
She brandished the pad the young Zabrak had had with him.
On this pad, Darth Sidious gave to Maul our Sith learning modules, plus standard educational modules from a military academy on tactics, geography, ships, etc. The Sith documents are divided into historical accounts and philosophical texts.
Jocasta took a deep breath.
The historical documents cover a long time period, but there is also a recent history section, starting with Darth Bane escaping the Jedi-Sith Wars and continuing on, mostly uninterrupted until the past century. I suspect the past few members of the line of Bane aren't in there because they have yet to write their histories. This almost certainly includes Chief Palpatine.
The council was silent in dismay. Any moment they'd get their wits about them and start protesting, so she pulled up her second set of evidence.
And these are hollows of the art decorating Palpatine's chambers. This bas-relief depicts Jedi being overrun during the Great Hyperspace War against the Sith and their creatures. A strange choice for a Nubian senator to have in his chambers, but perhaps explainable if it weren't for the other art. These 4 statues are of the 4 sages of Dorothy, one of whom was well known for their fascination with the dark side. And then there's this chalice.
She nodded over at Jan.
It's a Sith incense burner from the same time period of the Great Hyperspace War.
He pulled up his own pad to show a hollow of what looked to be the same incense burner, alight with red-blue flames, while Sith kneeled around it.
The form is very distinct and was used for their initiation rituals and for meditation. To further to confirm this, I went to the remains of Palpatine's chambers today to find the burner. It had been destroyed, but the metal still reeks of the dark side when it's touched.
dangerous to do. That was, if Sith artifact it is, said Yaddle with a frown, and stand accused the Jedi do.
Nothing had been said officially to them by authorities or the Senate guards, especially since Teres Nube had almost immediately released a statement that he was there on a completely different mission, complete with what she suspected was an account of an earlier mission, which had also necessitated Terra sneaking into 500 Republica. That had turned some of the tide of condemnation away from the Jedi, but only after several hours of Palpatine's carefully planted insinuations from that vid.
With Palpatine disappeared, we must take our evidence from wherever we can,
said Jan stiffly.
Nor did I force my way in. I recommend we have a master skilled in psychometry, examiner's quarters, and his hidden lair, if they will still give us access. We will do so once a Jedi with the power returns to the temple,
said Adi.
Currently the only Jedi on planet with the skill is Quinlan Voss, and I'm sure we all can agree he must not be allowed anywhere near potential Sith belongings.
It's unlikely they will allow us near after today,
said Terra thoughtfully.
I've reports that they found a lightsaber in the rubble.
He held up a hollow showing a singed half of a lightsaber.
The report doesn't mention what color the crystal is, but I doubt this belonged to a Sith.
I concur, said Jocasta. I would say that lightsaber resembles those styles in vogue, from the last century even. I will search the archives and see.
All knights and masters had their lightsaber styles recorded at the time of their promotion.
Thank you, Madame Nu,
said Terra.
Fortunately, Thawne was able to get to Palpatine's lair before the Senate investigators found it,
said Terra.
We have a slicer working on what he brought back, though much was fire damaged. So just like that, we must accept that the Sith have been hiding in plain sight from us for the past 1,000 years,
demanded even Biel.
Perhaps he's at the dark side who is following Sith philosophies,
suggested Sacy Teen.
Jocasta shook her head. That wouldn't explain how we got all these Sith teachings that we have never heard of.
Adi sighed.
If he's a Sith, he's a master at hiding himself. I've met him while at the Senate, and there wasn't even a hint of the dark side from him.
He's a truly great actor, judging by that hollow, said C.
Hide themselves from even the Jedi, the Sith could,
said Yoda, breaking his silence for the first time this meeting.
Not like the old Sith the Banites are. Always two there are, master and apprentice. Not many. Hide in the shadows all these years, I can believe they did.
Jocasta saw Jan slightly relax next to her. Now that Yoda was on their side, the rest of the council would eventually follow.
I'm still not convinced,
said Ivan stubbornly. Tavoka growled.
Sifo-Dyas. Have you ever seen the Sith in your visions?
C looked a bit startled to be addressed in this debate.
My visions rarely come with name tags or dialogue, but I have seen what I would class as Darksiders in black, wielding red lightsabers. I saw one in a black robe on a throne with space behind them, laughing as lightsabers of red and green crossed, but if it was Palpatine I cannot say. Their face was a ruin. What did Tade Vizsla's holocron say?
Asked C, turning the question back to Jocasta.
The fall of the Jedi to Darjetti, as he calls them. That is, said Jocasta, unfortunately the same word for both Darksiders and Sith in Mendoa.
Sith, Palpatine is,
insisted Yoda.
Feel lighter, the Force does with him flint. If just Darksider he was, feel it, we would not.
It was an excellent point, and many of the council closed their eyes to reach out to the Force. Ivan sighed, but nodded his agreement.
If Palpatine is a Sith, then what are we to do with the Sith apprentice we have?
Said Ki Adi.
Visited Maul? I have,
said Yoda, surprising everyone.
Much fewer anger I sense in him. No place for him at this temple there is.
Try telling the Mandalorians that we're going to abandon the child,
said Tavoka. Yoda was nodding in agreement. Yoda looked at him imperiously.
Other Jedi temples there are now,
he said pointedly. Tavoka relaxed.
Yes, send him there,
said C, grinning, eyes distant. Joe suspected he was seeing a vision.
He will do well as a Mandalorian and maybe as a Jedi. There are his brothers as well.
He trailed off, eyes becoming completely unfocused. Yaddle leaned to the right, and you could just see her small hand poke aside before he snapped back to the present.
So we are all agreed the Sith have returned,
said Tavoka.
Now the question is, what do we do about it? May we be excused?
Asked Jan hurriedly. Both of them knew from their own time on the council when to make themselves scarce before an endless debate.
Always so hasty,
muttered Terra, but Joe thought she sensed a hint of envy in the statement. They were excused, and just in time, as the council erupted into a flurry of debate behind them. Sifo-Dyas' dreams were finally his own, not because they'd stuck him in a Beskar helmet like some had suggested when he first arrived on Mandalore, but because exploring the Vizsla Temple had led to the discovery that it was partially built on one of the planet's rare Beskar deposits. Most Beskar was found on Concordia, but of course, there had been mines on Mandalore thousands of years past, and there were still a few scattered or rich soils. The row of chambers in the lower levels and eastern side of the temple all held faint traces of the ore, which neatly muffled the force outside of the room unless he tried to reach further. It would be a bit stifling to stay here all the time, but his mental health had improved immensely for having a safe place to retreat and sleep peacefully. It was very necessary, considering he was a member of the main Jedi Council now, and stuck in such endless debates about what to do about the Sith, that they made the debates about the Mandalorians seem like child's play. He made his way up towards the refectory, smiling to hear the chattering voices of the first Crush clan to move into the newly activated temple. In amongst them was young Maul, who often seemed puzzled by the kindness and light surrounding him. He expected there would be more coming to the Vizsla Temple soon, with Plo Koon having recently been assigned as the temple head. After breakfast, he received a comm that his ride was waiting for him. For some reason, despite Yaddle being on planet, he'd been made the official council liaison with the Mandalore. Not that this was too much of a hardship, because having to brave the true Mandalorian compound and its amorous Mandos regularly. He also could see why his two best friends had gotten along so well with the Mandalore. Jaster was practical, easy to talk to, and a solid, steady presence in the Force. C had enjoyed the one night he and Do had spent with the man, though he had no intention of being the permanent fixture Joe and Do had become whenever they were on planet. Outside, the sun was bright enough that he pulled up his robe's hood to shade himself from the glare. Knight Femor was waiting for him in the driver's seat of the speeder.
Master Sifo-Dyas,
said the man with a nod. C suspected it was comforting for the knight to retain some Jedi formality when he wasn't in the presence of the informal Mandalorians. It was the only reason he hadn't insisted the knight call him C already. After all, he was Do's grand Padawan, and had to be aware how close he, Joe, and Do were.
Knight Femor, I'm surprised it's not a Mandalorian picking me up.
There was some sort of ranked fighting system the true Mandalorians used to see who got to pick him up from the temple on the days he visited them.
I put my name at the top of the list, said Femor with a smirk.
Sifo-Dyas suspected that meant he'd gotten up early enough to beat whoever was supposed to ferry him to the punch, but it was just as likely Femor had actually beaten whichever Mandalorian in battle for the right. If it was the second option, it had probably made the Mandalorians' day.
You wished to speak with me, then?
Femor nodded and started the speeder, winding at a casual pace through the canyons.
Yes, since you're on the council, you know that I was on a mission to find the authors of the book, and that I found them.
C nodded. Although the authors' identities had been shared with the Mandalore, the council was otherwise keeping them secret.
When I met them, they informed me they'd received a strange message from the Tarabe sector telling them to change the title of the book. From what I could tell several months ago, you were the only Jedi in that sector.
Ah, said C, trying to decide what to say. His visions now came during the day only. They weren't the absolute horrors he had been seeing for years, not since he sent that simple comm to Onderan. But the Jedi were not out of the woods yet. The Sith were trying to kill them. With the Jedi spread more across the galaxy in auxiliary temples, it wasn't getting flashes of full-blown slaughter and an empty temple anymore. Just isolated incidents where Jedi were killed by men in armor. The same men he also saw Jedi fighting alongside. He hoped that the changes which were underway, that they had sent at least one Sith into hiding, would eventually make even those scenes disappear, even as he worried that not everything in the galaxy could be solved by a romance novel.
My report was submitted over a month ago, so I have no reason to report this to the council, said Femor, seeming to concentrate fully on his driving. I was just curious as to who and why.
Sifo-Dyas relaxed. Explanations he could do.
I have had visions of the Jedi dying since I was a Padawan. They were never coherent enough to explain well, and acting on them seemed unwise, even as they tortured me with visions of the temple, empty, lifeless. Several months ago I got a happier vision. It was a Jedi Nigo Diaz, I believe, fighting alongside a whole group of Mandalorians in armor against the Hutt and their forces. When I asked the Force how such an unlikely vision came to pass, it showed me the authors on Onderon, and how their choice of title would either change the galaxy or doom the novel to obscurity.
C couldn't explain how it had felt to be hovering on that precipice.
I don't often act on my visions, usually only when action can immediately help people. I've been at a loss as to what I could do to stop the future I saw for the Jedi, but a simple sentence sent by Calm, after I sent it, the entire future of the galaxy felt lighter.
Femor was silent for a long moment. They were now navigating the streets of the capital city of Keldabe.
As the watchman for the sector, I've been informed that Tadavizla also constructed the temple because he was seeing visions of the death of both the Jedi and the Mandalorians. Have you talked with his holocron to compare notes?
C juggled.
If you think Joe has let anyone else near it before she and Chester finish their research, you're delusional.
Femor blanched at the idea of disturbing Joe at anything. Her iron rule of the archives was the stuff of legends.
But you're right. She has told me to talk with Vizsla's holocron soon, now that we know of the Sith. I suspect neither of us have seen enough to act upon, but now that we know the Sith are no longer extinct, maybe there will be clues.
Perhaps they had both seen the same Sith. C hadn't wanted to tell the council and damn an innocent, but he had seen an adult Maul once long ago, cloaked in darkness and wielding a double-sided red lightsaber. They pulled into the two Mandalorians' compound, pausing for the scan from the guard before being waved through. Arla Fett, the Mandalore's daughter, was waiting. Sifo-Dyas wondered idly if Femor knew how much his face lit up at the sight of her.
Just pause in the armory, so I'll lead you there,
she said once Seymour had barked. Upon being informed of the Sith's existence in their last meeting, Jaster had immediately begun planning what to do to fight the Sith, and started his own investigation into if Palpatine had been interfering in anything other than the events on Ghalad Dhran. So far, he had discovered that the Sith owned shares of some of the Concordian mines. C had encouraged him to search deeper, urged on by the Force. The future was ever in motion, but C knew that if the Sith were to ever fall, it must be through the growing partnership of the Jedi and the Mandalorians.